The rain hadn't let up since dawn, and by the time we stepped out of St. Luke's Church, the gray Seattle sky felt like it had settled into my bones. Henry Sullivan had been more than my grandfather. He'd been the steady voice in a life that had too often been ruled by sharp words and colder silences. The service was quiet, dignified, filled with faces from the community he'd built so much for. My father, Victor, stood front and center, accepting condolences like a politician on election night. His handshakes were firm, his smile measured. I thought maybe for once grief had softened him. That hope didn't last long. Hours later, the mourners gone, the scent of damp flowers still heavy in the air. I found myself in the estate's drawing room. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the old pine mantel where Henry used to rest his arm when telling me one of his stories. Victor walked in, his expression stripped of the polite mask he'd worn all day. "It's done," he said flatly. "The estate transfer is official. 400 million locked in my name." He said it like a man announcing the weather, then let a small smirk curl his mouth. I nodded slowly, unsure what he expected me to say. He didn't give me the chance. "You're useless now." The words hung there, too absurd to register at first. "Excuse me. You've coasted long enough," he said, his tone cutting clean through the air. "Pack your things. I want you out of the house by morning." For a moment, I couldn't feel my hands. This was my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd lectured me about ambition, now looking at me like I was a piece of unwanted furniture. I stood, forcing my spine straight, even as my chest tightened. Fine. My voice didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that. I walked out of the room, the echo of my footsteps following me down the long hall toward the bedroom that had never really felt like mine. I grew up in a house where silence was a form of control. Victor's rules were precise and absolute. No slammed doors, no talking back, and never under any circumstance challenge his decisions. My earliest memories of him are measured in corrections, posture, too slouched tone, too sharp, ambitions too unrealistic. By the time I was 10, I'd learned to keep my victories to myself. If I brought home an A, he'd ask why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he'd wonder aloud how many other kids hadn't bothered to compete. Praise was rare, and when it came, it felt more like a footnote than a celebration. Henry was different. My grandfather's presence was like stepping into a warm patch of sunlight after being indoors too long. He didn't push me to be perfect. He asked me what I wanted, and then listened. Really listened to the answer. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to work in finance to understand the currents that moved money and power. Victor scoffed, called it a man's world. Henry just smiled and told me to learn everything I could. Years later, when I was accepted into a competitive graduate program, Victor dismissed it as a waste of time and money. I remember sitting on the porch with Henry that night, my acceptance letter in my lap, wondering if I should turn it down. He sipped his sweet tea, then quietly slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check large enough to cover my tuition for the first year. "Don't tell him," Henry said. "This is between us. Consider it an investment in someone worth investing in." That was Henry believing in me when it cost him something. Now, standing in my childhood bedroom with a half-packed suitcase, I thought of that night and the quiet pride in his eyes. Victor could strip me of this house, but he couldn't erase the foundation Henry had given me. As I reached for another hanger, something hard shifted inside the lining of my old bookshelf. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Within days of the funeral, the warmth Henry had brought to the estate seemed to evaporate, replaced by something sharper, colder. Doors that had always been left open were now locked. The library, the sunroom, even the small study where Henry kept his records. Each handle rattled uselessly when I tried it. The staff people I'd known for years avoided my eyes. Clara, the housekeeper who used to sneak me scones from the kitchen, gave only curt nods, now her hands busy with tasks that didn't need doing. When I asked if something was wrong, she murmured Mr. Sullivan's instructions before hurrying away. At dinner, Victor spoke as if I weren't there. He discussed moving forward with an air of finality, talking about renovations, new investments, and streamlining the household in ways that made it clear I wasn't part of his plans. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone cutting away what he considered dead weight. Back in my room, I tried to focus on packing. My fingers skimmed along the spines of books I'd kept since high school comfort, in a time when I'd needed safe places to hide my thoughts. One, a thick biography Henry had given me on my 18th birthday, slid forward more easily than the others. When I pulled it free, something small and firm shifted inside. I flipped it open and found a sealed envelope tucked deep between the last few pages. My name, Elise, in Henry's steady hand, stood out against the cream paper. I sat on the edge of the bed, tearing the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a single piece of stationery. The ink, faint but deliberate. The will protects those who protect others. No explanation, no context, just that one line weighty enough to stop me cold. I read it again, tracing the words as if more meaning might appear. Henry had hidden it for me to find. Not Victor, not anyone else. I folded the note back into the envelope and slid it into my bag, my mind already turning over what it could mean. Victor's study smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished leather, the same as it had when Henry used it, only now the warmth was gone. Victor sat behind the heavy walnut desk, leaning back in Henry's old chair, as though it had always belonged to him. A crystal tumbler of bourbon rested at his elbow, half full, catching the light from the desk lamp. "Sit," he said, not looking up from the papers in front of him. I didn't move until he finally raised his eyes, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you've heard," he began, as though the whole city wasn't already buzzing. 400 million, all mine." Henry was generous. His voice carried no trace of grief, only the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game they'd stacked in their favor. I stayed quiet, letting him fill the air. "You've had a long, comfortable stay here, Elise." He continued his tone, shifting to something colder. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a financial burden. And frankly, you've been coasting." He said it like a verdict, not an opinion. I almost laughed. I'd been working since I was 16, paying my own way through most of grad school, thanks to Henry, not him. But arguing now would be like shouting into the wind. "I want you out by morning," he said, leaning forward, elbows on the desk. "No drama, no drawn-out goodbyes. This is my house now, and I decide who belongs here." His gaze lingered on me, waiting for the crack, the flinch, the desperate protest. I felt the weight of Henry's note in my pocket, the words burning against my leg. "The will protects those who protect others." I straightened my shoulders. Fine. No tremor in my voice. No hesitation. I rose, turned, and walked out without another word. Upstairs, I finished packing the last of my clothes into the worn leather suitcase Henry had given me years ago. The envelope stayed in my coat pocket, as if moving it might weaken whatever strength it had given me in that room. By the time the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9, my bags were by the door. I didn't look back when I stepped outside into the cool Seattle night. By the next afternoon, I was hauling my suitcase up the narrow staircase of a brick walk-up in downtown Seattle. The apartment was barely big enough for me to stretch my arms without touching both walls, but it was mine. No locked doors, no eyes watching to see if I measured up. I'd sold a few pieces of jewelry Victor had given me over the years, gifts more for show than sentiment. The cash wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the deposit and my first month's rent. My job as a financial analyst let me work remotely, so I set up my laptop on the little kitchen table and kept my hours steady, forcing normalcy into the chaos. Still at night, I'd catch myself pulling the envelope from my coat pocket, rereading Henry's words. "The will protects those who protect others." It didn't sound like something he'd say casually, and it certainly didn't sound like a message meant for Victor. I started digging quietly public records, probate filings, even old news articles about estates with unusual clauses. Most of it was noise, but every so often I'd find something that made my pulse jump. Trusts that released funds only under specific conditions. Wills tied to joint ventures or community projects. Henry had been meticulous in everything he did. It was possible, maybe even likely, that his will carried the same precision. 3 days after I moved in, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me swipe to answer. Elise Sullivan. The voice was crisp, professional, with an undercurrent of dry amusement. "This is Margaret Hayes. I was your grandfather's attorney." A pause deliberate. "We should talk about his will. It's unusual." There was a flicker of satisfaction in her tone, like she was holding back from saying more until we were face to face. I sat up straighter. "How unusual." She gave a short, knowing laugh. "Let's just say your father's week is about to get a lot more complicated. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I glanced at the envelope on the table, my mind already racing ahead. Margaret Hayes's office was nothing like I expected. No polished walnut or antique rugs, just clean lines, muted colors, and a wall of neatly labeled files. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, then folded her hands, studying me with the kind of look that says she already knows more than she's letting on. "I've been waiting for you to call," she began. "Your grandfather anticipated certain dynamics in this family." I arched a brow, meaning my father. "Meaning exactly your father," she said, pulling a thick binder toward her. "Henry placed his estate everything in a trust. Victor cannot access a cent of the 400 million unless specific conditions are met." I leaned forward, pulse quickening. What conditions? Her lips curved slightly like she'd been waiting for that question. "He must complete a community redevelopment project that meets city approval and Henry's philanthropic standards, and he must do it with you as co-executive. Equal authority, equal signature rights." I sat back, trying to process. "You're saying he can't do it without me?" "Correct. There's more," she continued. "During the 12 months it takes to complete the project, there can be no lawsuits between you and Victor, no public estrangement, and no formal withdrawal from the arrangement by either party. Any violation and the trust dissolves, and the money Margaret flipped to the final page of the clause, half would go to the charities. Henry named the other half directly to you." For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I thought about Victor in his study, smug and certain he'd already won. I thought about him telling me I was useless. "Henry really planned this," I murmured. "He wanted to ensure the person he trusted most was in a position to protect his legacy," Margaret said. "And that person wasn't your father." I traced my fingers along the edge of the desk, a slow, deliberate motion. "When does Victor find out?" Margaret's smile widened just slightly. "He already has." I felt the shift in my chest, anticipation steady and cold. Then, I suppose I should be expecting a knock at my door. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after leaving Margaret's office, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, Victor stood there, expensively dressed, but the edges frayed. His face was pale, a faint sheen of sweat along his hairline. "Elise," he said, forcing a smile. "Thought we should talk family to family." I stepped aside without a word, letting him into the cramped living room. He glanced around, eyes lingering on the second-hand furniture, like it was a personal insult. "The bank tells me there's been a misunderstanding." He began settling onto the sofa. "Funds are tied up in some sort of trust. Ridiculous red tape." His tone was light, but I could hear the strain under it. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "It's the will." He waved a dismissive hand. "Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm sure we can work around it." He leaned forward, softening his voice. "You and I, blood is blood. We've had our differences, but we can come together now. Make this work for both of us." Henry's words flickered in my mind. "Don't react. Negotiate." "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked evenly. "That you sign whatever is needed so I can move forward. You'll get something, of course." I held his gaze. "That's not how it's written." His smile thinned. "Elise, I'm offering you a way to make this painless. You think you can run a multi-million-dollar project without me? You'll sink us both." The threat was there, coiled under the words. But I didn't flinch. "If you want the money," I said, "you'll follow the terms. All of them." A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment, I thought he might explode, but instead, he stood straightening his jacket. "Think about it," he said, and walked out without another glance. I closed the door behind him, already knowing I wouldn't need to. He'd be back. 2 days after our first meeting, I had the agreement ready. Margaret had helped me refine it, each clause crafted with the same precision Henry had used in his will. Victor would publicly acknowledge me as co-executive, cover my living costs for the duration of the project, and transfer 3 specific estate properties into my name. Outright no conditions, no reversals. When I slid the document across Margaret's conference table, Victor's eyes skimmed it, then flicked up to me. "You can't be serious?" Every word I said. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I'm not signing this. You're extorting me." I didn't blink. "The will is extorting you. I'm just giving you a way forward." For the next week, he stalled, claimed he was busy with other matters, sent back pages with red ink scrolled across the margins. Even consulted another lawyer, a sharp-suited man who lasted one meeting before quietly confirming the truth. Henry's language was airtight. Without my cooperation, Victor's $400 million might as well have been buried in the ground. When he finally returned to Margaret's office, he was quieter. Not defeated exactly, but there was a weight in his posture, a tightness around his mouth. He picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, and signed each page with quick, sharp strokes. Margaret notarized it, her expression neutral, though I caught the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Victor pushed the signed packet toward me, his knuckles white. "I hope you know what you're doing, Elise." "I do," I said, tucking the agreement into my folder. We stood, the air between us heavy with everything unspoken. He left without shaking my hand, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift, not just in paperwork, but in power, and it was only the beginning. The waterfront lot had been little more than a patch of cracked asphalt and weeds when we began. Henry's plans called for something alive. Glass walls opening to the harbor classrooms for job training and space for local markets on weekends. From the first week, I made it my business to know every detail. I walked the site with the contractors each morning, reviewed invoices at night, and built relationships with the city officials whose signatures we needed. The more I showed up, the more the crews looked to me for decisions. Victor hated it. He showed up late to meetings, floated ideas to trim the budget that ignored both code and Henry's vision. Whenever I refused, he muttered about me being impossible to work with. But he never tried to shut me out. He couldn't. The will made sure of that. The press loved the story Sullivan Family Unites to honor Patriarch's dream. They photographed us side by side, smiling for the cameras. In the glossy spreads, we looked like a team. Behind those smiles, every conversation was a negotiation. By month 11, the center's steel frame was complete glass panels catching the morning sun. Victor stood with me on the balcony overlooking the water, watching crews set the final supports. "You've handled yourself better than I expected." He said the words clipped but genuine. "Better than you wanted," I replied. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Maybe." It wasn't trust. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement, however grudging, that I wasn't the liability he'd painted me to be. And in a few weeks, the project would be finished and the will's conditions met. The ribbon cutting drew a crowd large enough to spill onto the sidewalks. City leaders, reporters, and families from the neighborhood gathered under a bright spring sun, the new community center gleaming behind us. Victor stood to my left, hands clasped, smile practiced. The cameras loved him, but the speeches weren't his to give. That was Henry's stipulation and mine. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium. I spoke about Henry's belief that wealth meant little if it didn't lift others. I thanked the contractors, volunteers, and the community who'd worked alongside us. I didn't mention Victor. The applause started slow, then built into something steady and warm, rolling over the courtyard. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Victor's expression tighten, his jaw set, as the focus stayed on me. By the end of the day, the trust's conditions were fulfilled. Victor would have his fortune. I had something different, 3 prime estate properties in my name, and the public credit for bringing Henry's vision to life. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped away down the side path, my heels clicking against the new brickwork. The center stood behind me, alive with voices exactly as Henry had imagined. I didn't look back at Victor. I didn't need to. I'd taken the part of my family's legacy worth keeping and left the rest in the past. Elise learns a profound lesson about resilience and the power of self-worth in the face of betrayal and control. Initially cast out by her father Victor, who dismisses her as a burden despite her accomplishments, Elise discovers her grandfather Henry's hidden note and will, which empower her to reclaim her agency. Through the conditions of the trust, she realizes that true strength lies not in seeking approval from those who diminish her, but in standing firm in her own value and capabilities. Henry's belief in her, contrasted with Victor's rejection, teaches Elise to trust her own competence and to navigate power dynamics with strategic patience. By leading the community project and outmaneuvering her father, she transforms his attempt to erase her into an opportunity to secure her independence and legacy. This experience solidifies her understanding that legacy is not just wealth or status, but the impact one creates through integrity and purpose. Elise emerges with 3 estate properties and public recognition proving that her worth rooted in Henry's quiet faith is unshakable even against those who try to define her otherwise.
Growing up as the middle child in the Chin family meant I was constantly caught between my overachieving older sister Lisa and my academically gifted younger brother David. While Lisa excelled in business and David dominated in mathematics and science, I found my passion in art history and cultural studies. Unfortunately, my family viewed this as the soft option, something you did when you couldn't handle real subjects. Art doesn't pay the bills, Dad would say whenever I brought home another A+ in my art history courses. You need practical skills, not opinions about old paintings. Lisa was particularly dismissive of my interests. 5 years older and already climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm, she never missed an opportunity to point out how impractical my studies were. Maya's got her head in the clouds, she'd announce at family gatherings. While I'm closing million-dollar deals, she's writing essays about dead painters. The comments stung, but I'd learned to let them roll off me. I knew my work had value even if my family couldn't see it. After graduating with a master's degree in art history and cultural preservation, I'd found a position that perfectly combined my academic background with practical applications. I worked for a federal cultural heritage protection program, helping to track stolen artwork, authenticate historical pieces and investigate art fraud cases. The job was fascinating and important, but I kept the details vague when talking to my family. They knew I worked for the government in cultural something, but they assumed it was a boring desk job filing papers about museum acquisitions. I didn't bother correcting their assumptions. At least it's stable government work, Mom would say consolingly. Even if it's not very prestigious. Lisa would nod sympathetically. Government jobs are perfect for people who don't want too much responsibility. What my family didn't understand was that my work involved serious criminal investigations. Art theft is a multi-billion-dollar international criminal enterprise, often connected to money laundering, terrorism funding, and organized crime networks. My expertise in authentication and provenance research made me valuable to federal law enforcement agencies tracking stolen cultural artifacts. The complexity of my actual work became clear during a case I'd been working on for 8 months. A network of stolen Renaissance paintings had surfaced in various auction houses across the country, all with falsified provenance documents. The FBI's art crime team had brought me in as a consultant to help trace the origins and identify the forgeries. The investigation led to a major breakthrough when we discovered that several legitimate collectors had unknowingly purchased stolen pieces. The artwork needed to be temporarily confiscated while we built our criminal case against the theft ring. This meant that some very expensive, very beautiful pieces needed secure storage while serving as evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. Since I had the highest security clearance on the team and expertise in art preservation, I was authorized to store several pieces in my home's climate-controlled basement. My house had been modified with museum-quality environmental controls, security systems, and fire suppression specifically for this purpose. The FBI covered all the costs for the modifications since the arrangement saved them thousands in professional storage fees. The pieces I was storing were extraordinarily valuable, not just financially but historically. A small Picasso sketch worth $45,000, a Renaissance-era illuminated manuscript valued at $35,000, and a collection of Asian antiquities worth approximately $40,000. All were stolen goods being held as evidence while we pursued the criminal network that had trafficked them. I loved having the pieces in my house, even temporarily. Every morning, I'd spend a few minutes in the basement just appreciating the craftsmanship and historical significance of what I was protecting. It felt like being a guardian of cultural heritage, which was exactly why I'd gotten into this field. My family, however, saw my collection very differently during their occasional visits. Maya's weird art phase is getting expensive, Lisa would comment, glancing at the pieces without really seeing them. How much did you spend on all this old stuff? They're not purchases, I'd explain. They're part of my work. Work? Dad would laugh. You mean the government pays you to collect art? I tried to explain that the pieces were evidence in federal investigations, but my family interpreted this as me trying to make my hobby sound more important than it was. She probably bought them at estate sales and made up stories about their significance, Lisa whispered to Mom during one visit, not quite quietly enough. The dismissive comments continued for months. Every family gathering included some reference to my expensive taste or impractical spending habits. Lisa particularly enjoyed making jokes about my investment in old paintings nobody cares about. Normal people put money in retirement accounts, she'd announce. Maya puts money in dusty artwork. The situation reached a breaking point last spring when I was called away on an urgent assignment to authenticate a collection of potentially stolen artifacts in Miami. The case was time-sensitive and required my immediate presence for 2 weeks. Since the artwork in my basement was secure and monitored by federal surveillance systems, I didn't worry about leaving it unattended. What I didn't anticipate was my family's reaction to my absence. 3 days into my Miami assignment, I received a text from Lisa. Stopped by to check on your house. Everything looks fine, but seriously, Maya, the amount of money you've wasted on that basement gallery is concerning. I texted back, please don't go in the basement. The security system is very sensitive. Relax. I'm not going to steal your precious art collection. The next text came 2 days later. Had an appraiser look at your pieces. You might have better taste than I thought. Some of this stuff is actually valuable. My blood went cold. Lisa, you brought an appraiser to my house? Without asking. I was worried you'd gotten scammed by art dealers. Turns out some pieces are worth serious money. The appraiser thinks you could get $120,000 for the whole collection. I immediately called her. Lisa, you cannot sell my collection. Those pieces are not for sale. Maya, we need to talk about this practically. You're sitting on $120,000 worth of art while complaining about student loan payments. It's irresponsible not to monetize assets. Those pieces are not assets. They're evidence in federal investigations. Lisa laughed. Come on, Maya. Stop trying to make your art hobby sound like police work. You bought expensive art you can't afford and now you're embarrassed about it. I'm serious, Lisa. Do not touch anything in my basement. I'm trying to help you make a smart financial decision for once in your life. The conversation ended with Lisa promising not to do anything dramatic, but I could hear the wheels turning in her mind. Lisa had always been convinced that I was financially irresponsible, and now she thought she'd discovered proof that I'd been lying about my income and spending habits. I tried to focus on my work in Miami, but I was distracted by worry about what Lisa might do. I considered flying back early, but the authentication work was critical to a major federal case. I decided to trust that Lisa wouldn't actually sell anything without talking to me first. I was wrong. The call came on Friday morning, just as I was finishing my final authentication report. Maya. The voice was unfamiliar and panicked. Yes, who is this? This is Robert Hartman from Hartman Fine Art Gallery. I purchased a collection from your sister yesterday, and we have a serious problem. My stomach dropped. What kind of problem? FBI agents are in my gallery right now, confiscating everything I bought from Lisa Chin. They're saying the pieces are stolen goods and evidence in a federal investigation. They want to know how I obtained federal evidence. I closed my eyes. Mr. Hartman, I work for the FBI's Cultural Heritage Protection Program. Those pieces were evidence in an ongoing federal investigation, stored at my residence under official authorization. Your sister said they were your personal collection and you needed money for student loans. My sister committed theft of federal evidence. She had no right to sell those pieces. But I paid $120,000. I have a bill of sale signed by Lisa Chin. Mr. Hartman, I'm very sorry, but you've been defrauded. Those pieces were never for sale and my sister had no legal authority to sell them. I could hear shouting in the background of Hartman's call. The FBI agents want to speak with you immediately, he said. They're asking if you were complicit in selling federal evidence. Tell them I'm Agent Maya Chin, badge number 4471, and I've been in Miami on official assignment. I had no knowledge of this sale. I hung up and immediately called my supervisor in D.C. Agent Chin. Director Williams answered on the first ring. We've got a situation at your residence. Sir. My sister sold the evidence pieces while I was in Miami. Your sister committed theft of federal evidence, fraud, and obstruction of a federal investigation. We need you back in D.C. immediately. The flight home was a nightmare. I spent 3 hours trying to understand how Lisa could have done something so catastrophically stupid. She'd somehow convinced herself that I was lying about my job, my income, and the nature of my art collection. In her mind, she was helping me make a smart financial decision by liquidating what she thought were my personal assets. But what Lisa didn't realize was that she'd committed multiple federal felonies: theft of federal evidence, fraud, obstruction of justice, and interfering with a criminal investigation. The pieces she'd sold weren't just valuable artwork. They were crucial evidence in a case against an international art theft ring. I landed in D.C. and drove straight to the FBI field office, where Director Williams and 2 agents from the art crime team were waiting. "Agent Chin," Williams said grimly, "we need to know everything about how your sister gained access to the evidence." I explained the security system, Lisa's visits to check on the house, and her conviction that I was financially irresponsible. "She genuinely believed she was helping me," I said. "She thought I'd wasted money on expensive art and needed to liquidize assets to pay bills." "Agent Chin, your sister's intentions are irrelevant. She committed theft of federal evidence. The pieces she sold were critical to building our case against a criminal network that's stolen millions in cultural artifacts." "What's the damage to the investigation?" "Substantial. The buyer, Hartman, claims he purchased in good faith, but now the chain of custody for our evidence is compromised. Defense attorneys will argue that the evidence was contaminated. Your sister may have inadvertently helped the criminals we've been pursuing for months." I felt sick. What happens to Lisa? She'll be arrested and charged with multiple federal crimes. Theft of federal evidence carries up to 10 years in prison. The agents explained that they'd already traced the entire transaction. Lisa had contacted Robert Hartman, describing herself as my financial advisor, who was helping me liquidate assets. She'd forged my signature on bills of sale and presented herself as acting with my authority. Hartman had paid $120,000 for what he thought was a legitimate private collection. "Where's the money?" I asked. "Your sister deposited it in what she thought was your bank account. She apparently believed she was doing you a favor by forcing you to sell what she considered impractical investments." That evening, I drove to my parents' house for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. The family was gathered for dinner, and Lisa was clearly the star of the evening. "There she is," Dad called out as I walked in. "Lisa told us about your big art sale. $120,000. We had no idea you were sitting on such valuable pieces." Mom hugged me. "We're so proud that you finally made a practical financial decision. Lisa said the money will help with your student loans." I looked around the table at my family's happy faces. They had no idea that Lisa had just destroyed her life by committing federal crimes. "Your weird art sold for $120,000. Lisa announced dramatically, clearly having practiced this moment. The family burst into celebration. "Finally useful for something." Mom cheered, raising her glass. Everyone was applauding and congratulating Lisa for her financial advice. I smiled and said nothing, trying to figure out how to explain what had actually happened. "Congratulations," I said quietly. Lisa was beaming with pride. "I know you're probably mad that I went behind your back, but Maya, you needed someone to make the hard financial decisions. You were sitting on a fortune while complaining about money. Tell me exactly how you sold the pieces," I said. "I found this gallery owner, Robert Hartman, who specializes in high-end art. He was very professional, did proper authentications, paid fair market value. The whole transaction was completely legitimate." "And you signed the bills of sale?" "I signed as your representative. I explained that you were out of town but had authorized the sale. Hartman was fine with it once I showed him my ID and explained our family relationship." My phone started ringing. Unknown number. "Hello. Is this Maya Chin?" The voice was panicked, almost screaming. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Robert Hartman from Hartman Fine Art Gallery. FBI agents are confiscating everything I bought from your sister." I walked into the kitchen for privacy. "Mr. Hartman, I need you to stay calm and cooperate fully with the agents. They're saying the pieces were stolen goods. They're saying I purchased federal evidence. How is that possible?" I could hear the celebration continuing in the dining room, completely oblivious to the disaster unfolding. "Mr. Hartman, those pieces were evidence in an FBI investigation. My sister had no authority to sell them. You were defrauded. But she signed bills of sale. She said she was your financial representative. My sister committed theft of federal evidence and fraud. I'm an FBI agent, and those pieces were evidence stored at my residence under official authorization. There was silence on the other end, then the sound of papers rustling frantically. Oh God, Hartman whispered. The agents are asking about obstruction of justice and trafficking in stolen goods. They want to know if I knew the pieces were evidence. Cooperate fully and tell them exactly what Lisa told you. You were a victim of fraud. I hung up and walked back to the dining room where Lisa was still holding court. Who was that? Dad asked. The gallery owner, I said calmly. Lisa perked up with interest. Everything okay? He seemed really professional when I worked with him. Lisa, I need you to understand something very important. Those pieces you sold weren't my personal collection. They were evidence in a federal FBI investigation, stored at my house under official authorization. The room went quiet. Lisa laughed nervously. Come on, Maya. Don't be dramatic. I know you work for the government doing something with art, but you make it sound like you're some kind of federal agent. I pulled out my badge and ID. I am Agent Maya Chin, badge number 4471, FBI Cultural Heritage Protection Program. The pieces you sold were evidence in an active federal investigation into international art theft. The color drained from Lisa's face. That's impossible. You work in some boring government office. I work for the FBI's art crime team. Those pieces were stolen artwork being held as evidence while we build a criminal case against the theft network. Dad was staring at my badge. Maya, are you really an FBI agent? Yes. And Lisa just committed theft of federal evidence, fraud, obstruction of justice, and interference with a criminal investigation. Lisa stood up suddenly. This is insane. I was trying to help you. You never told me you were an FBI agent. I told you repeatedly not to touch the pieces in my basement. I told you they were evidence in federal investigations. I thought you were making that up to sound important. Lisa, why would I make up being an FBI agent? Because you always felt inferior about your career compared to mine, she said weakly. The room was completely silent now. My parents were looking back and forth between Lisa and me, trying to understand how their successful older daughter had somehow committed federal crimes against their federal agent younger daughter. My phone rang again. Director Williams. Agent Chin, we need your sister to turn herself in for processing. Federal arrest warrants have been issued. She's here with my family right now. Can you bring her in, or do we need to send agents to the location? I looked at Lisa, who was starting to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. I'll bring her in, I said. After I hung up, I sat down across from Lisa. You need to come with me to the FBI field office. You're being charged with multiple federal felonies. Felonies? Mom gasped. Theft of federal evidence, fraud, forgery, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Each charge carries up to 10 years in prison. Lisa was crying now. I didn't know. I thought I was helping you. Lisa, you forged my signature and sold $120,000 worth of federal evidence. The fact that you thought you were helping doesn't change the crimes you committed. But you never told me you were an FBI agent. You never asked what I actually did. You just assumed I had some meaningless government job because that fit your image of me as the unsuccessful sister. Dad was staring at his hands. Maya, we had no idea about your real job. I tried to tell you the work was important, but you never took it seriously. We failed you, Mom said quietly. We treated your career like it was nothing when you were doing crucial law enforcement work. The immediate problem is Lisa's situation, I said. She needs a criminal defense attorney immediately. Federal prosecutors don't offer plea deals for theft of evidence. Lisa looked around the table desperately. Can't you just tell them it was a misunderstanding? That I didn't know. Lisa, you committed multiple federal felonies. My testimony would actually make your case worse because I can confirm that you had no authority to sell those pieces. But I'm your sister. Which makes this worse, not better. You violated my trust, compromised a federal investigation, and committed serious crimes. The drive to the FBI field office was silent. Lisa stared out the window, occasionally asking questions I couldn't answer about prison sentences and criminal records. How long have you been an FBI agent? she finally asked. 6 years. 6 years. You've been a federal agent for 6 years and I never knew. You never asked what I actually did. You just made assumptions and dismissed my work as unimportant. I thought you filed paperwork about museum donations. I investigate international art theft, authenticate stolen cultural artifacts, and build federal cases against criminal networks. Lisa was quiet for several blocks. The pieces I sold, how important were they to your case? Critical. They were key evidence in a case against a theft ring that's stolen millions in artwork. Your sale compromised months of investigation. I've destroyed everything. You've made the case much harder to prosecute. Defense lawyers will argue that the evidence was contaminated. At the FBI building, Lisa was processed and formally charged. She was released on bond but faced federal trial within 6 months. The charges were serious: theft of government property, wire fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. Robert Hartman, the gallery owner, was cleared of criminal charges but lost his $120,000. The Federal Victim Recovery Program would eventually reimburse him, but his reputation in the art world was damaged. Several clients canceled contracts because of the association with federal evidence trafficking. The stolen art pieces were recovered and returned to evidence storage, but the chain of custody issues created problems for our prosecution. The defense team argued that FBI evidence had been contaminated by family interference, and while we eventually won the case, the sentences were reduced due to procedural questions. Lisa's trial was brief. She pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She received 3 years in federal prison and 5 years of supervised probation. Her marketing career was over, and her federal conviction made future employment extremely difficult. During her sentencing hearing, Lisa finally acknowledged what she'd actually done. I convinced myself that my sister was financially irresponsible because I couldn't accept that she had a more important career than mine, she told the judge. I committed federal crimes because I refused to believe my younger sister was an FBI agent. Your assumption doesn't excuse theft of federal evidence, the judge replied. Your crimes compromised a major investigation and could have helped dangerous criminals escape justice. The hardest part of the entire situation was watching my parents struggle to understand how their family dynamics had contributed to Lisa's crimes. They'd spent years treating my career as less important than Lisa's corporate success, never bothering to learn what I actually did. We created this, Dad said during one difficult conversation. We made Lisa feel like she was supposed to be the successful one, and we made you feel like your work didn't matter. You made assumptions, I said. But Lisa chose to commit crimes based on those assumptions. If we'd taken your career seriously, she would have known you were an FBI agent. Maybe. But Lisa chose to sell things that didn't belong to her without asking permission. That's the core criminal behavior. Lisa served her full sentence and was released on parole. She now works at a nonprofit organization helping other federal prisoners reintegrate into society. We have limited contact, but she's been genuinely remorseful about the damage she caused. During one supervised visit, she looked around my basement office, now restored with new evidence pieces from different cases. I still can't believe you're an FBI agent, she said quietly. You never asked what I actually did. You just assumed it was nothing important. I couldn't handle that my younger sister was more successful than me. Success isn't a competition, Lisa. We could have both been successful in different fields. I destroyed my career because I couldn't accept yours. The case became a training example in FBI protocols about evidence storage and family security risks. My supervisor now requires all agents storing evidence at home to undergo family background checks and security briefings for household members. But for me, it was a lesson about the danger of family members who refuse to see you clearly. Lisa's crimes weren't really about money or art. They were about her inability to accept that her assumptions about me were completely wrong. She'd spent years convinced that I was the unsuccessful sister, and when evidence contradicted that belief, she chose to commit federal crimes rather than question her assumptions. The financial damage was $120,000. The investigative damage was months of compromised federal work. The family damage was a sister in federal prison. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones most invested in misunderstanding who you actually are. And sometimes, Protecting yourself from that willful misunderstanding requires consequences that feel disproportionate to the underlying emotional crime. Lisa learned that lesson through federal prison. My parents learned it through watching their daughter get sentenced for crimes they'd never imagined possible. And I learned it through the surreal experience of having my competence validated by federal prosecutors instead of my own family. The artwork I protect now includes pieces recovered from Lisa's case. Every morning when I check on the evidence in my basement, I'm reminded that cultural heritage protection isn't just about preserving beautiful objects. It's about maintaining the integrity of systems that separate legitimate ownership from criminal theft. Lisa crossed that line because she couldn't accept who I really was. The art pieces were just the vehicle for a much deeper crime, refusing to see her sister clearly enough to avoid destroying both our lives. The pattern had been the same for 3 years now. Every Sunday dinner, every family gathering, every phone call eventually circled back to the same conversation about my failure to launch. At 31, I was supposedly the family disappointment, the one who refused to get a real job, and instead spent my days playing with cameras, as Mom so eloquently put it. "Sarah, you need to face reality," Dad would say, cutting into his roast beef with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years in accounting. "This documentary thing you're doing, it's been 3 years. When are you going to admit it's not working?" Mom would nod vigorously, her perfectly styled hair catching the dining room light. "Your cousin Jennifer just got promoted to senior marketing manager. She has a 401k, Sarah. Health insurance. A future." I'd learned not to argue. Not to mention the film festivals, the small grants, the slowly building recognition in documentary circles. They saw my second-hand equipment, my cluttered apartment, my irregular schedule, and concluded I was wasting my life. What they didn't see was the investigation that had consumed 3 years of my life. The story that was about to change everything. The documentary had started as a local interest piece about urban development. I'd noticed patterns in city planning decisions, certain properties being rezoned just before major developments were announced, certain contractors always winning bids despite higher quotes. What began as curiosity about small-time corruption had uncovered a network spanning 5 states, involving federal contracts worth $2.3 billion. But explaining this at family dinners felt impossible. How do you tell your parents who've never understood your work that you've been documenting evidence of organized fraud that reaches into congressional offices? How do you explain that the reason you've been broke for 3 years is because you've spent every available dollar on travel, equipment, and legal consultations to ensure your evidence would stand up in court? The Williams family has always been practical, Grandma Rose would remind me during these conversations, her voice carrying the weight of immigrant wisdom. Your grandfather didn't build his business by chasing dreams. He worked hard, saved money, built something real. My brother Michael, 2 years younger and already a successful corporate lawyer, would usually chime in with what he considered helpful advice. "Sarah, I could get you interviews at several firms. Administrative assistant, maybe paralegal if you went back for certification. Something with steady income." The irony wasn't lost on me that Michael's law firms specialized in municipal contracts, the same type of contracts my investigation was exposing. But I'd learned to keep that detail to myself. The fewer people who knew the scope of what I was working on, the better. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier during Easter dinner. Mom had introduced me to her book club friends as our daughter who's still figuring things out. The pity in their eyes was unmistakable. One of them, Mrs. Patterson, had even pulled me aside later to suggest I consider teaching. "It's steady work," she'd said, patting my arm maternally. "And you'd have summers off to pursue your little film hobby." That night, I'd sat in my apartment editing footage of a city councilman taking an envelope of cash from a contractor, and I'd wondered if they were right. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe I was wasting my life chasing a story that would never see the light of day. But then the breakthrough had come. A former employee of one of the companies had reached out through encrypted channels, providing internal documents that connected everything. Suddenly, my 3 years of scattered evidence formed a complete picture of systematic fraud. I had names, dates, amounts, recorded conversations, and documentary proof of a conspiracy that had stolen millions from taxpayers. The first call had come from ProPublica. Then the Washington Post. Within 2 weeks, I was fielding inquiries from major news organizations, film distributors, and documentary streaming platforms. The story was bigger than I'd imagined, and my documentation was more comprehensive than anyone expected. But I hadn't told my family. How could I? They'd been so consistent in their dismissal that I'd learned to compartmentalize completely. At family gatherings, I was still the failure who played with cameras. In my professional life, I was becoming known as the documentary filmmaker who'd single-handedly exposed one of the largest municipal fraud rings in modern history. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Sitting through lectures about responsibility and maturity while knowing that federal prosecutors were using my footage as evidence in what would become a major RICO case. Nodding along to suggestions that I get a job at the post office while Hollywood producers were competing for distribution rights to my film. This Sunday's dinner had followed the familiar script until my phone rang during dessert. Earlier that week, the Academy had announced the nominees for Best Documentary Feature. I'd known my film Concrete Conspiracy. A 3-year investigation was being considered, but I hadn't expected the call to come during cherry pie at Mom and Dad's dining room table. "Your film thing isn't working," Dad had just finished saying, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. 3 years, Sarah. 3 years of this hobby, and what do you have to show for it? Mom had nodded emphatically. Mrs. Henderson's daughter started as a receptionist and now she manages the whole office. That's progress. That's building something. I'd opened my mouth to respond when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a New York number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Ms. Williams? This is 60 Minutes calling about your Oscar nomination and the documentary. We'd like to schedule an interview about your investigation and its impact on federal legislation." The words hung in the air like smoke. I watched my family's faces process what they'd just heard. Oscar nomination. 60 Minutes. Federal legislation. Dad's fork had frozen halfway to his mouth, a piece of cherry pie sliding slowly back onto his plate. Mom's coffee cup sat forgotten in her hands, cooling rapidly as she stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "I'm sorry," the voice on the phone continued. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" "No," I said, finding my voice. "This is perfect timing, actually." The silence stretched across the dining room like a physical presence. My brother Michael had gone completely still, his legal mind probably already calculating the implications of what he'd just heard. Grandma Rose had set down her teacup with the careful precision of someone trying not to make a sound. "We're particularly interested in discussing how your 3-year investigation led to the federal indictments announced this morning," the producer continued, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet of the dining room. 17 people charged, $2.3 billion in fraudulent contracts exposed, and 3 congressional ethics investigations opened. It's remarkable work. I stepped away from the table, walking toward the kitchen where I could speak more privately, but the open floor plan meant every word was audible to my family. "The impact has been beyond what I expected," I said into the phone, watching my parents' reflections in the kitchen window. "When I started documenting irregularities in municipal contracts 3 years ago, I thought I might have a story about small-time corruption. I never imagined it would lead to federal RICO charges." Behind me, I heard Dad's sharp intake of breath. "Your documentation was cited specifically in the federal prosecutor's statement," the producer continued. "They said without your footage and financial analysis, they wouldn't have had sufficient evidence to bring charges. How does it feel to know your work directly led to justice for taxpayers who were defrauded?" I turned back toward the dining room where my family sat frozen in tableau. "It feels like 3 years of work finally paid off," I said simply. The producer laughed. "I imagine your family is proud. This kind of investigative journalism is exactly why documentary filmmaking matters. Would Thursday work for the interview? We'd like to film at your apartment if possible. Show the workspace where you compiled all this evidence." After hanging up, I returned to the dining room where the silence had taken on a different quality. Not the judgmental quiet that usually followed their lectures about my life choices, but something closer to shock. Dad cleared his throat first. "Sarah, I think we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, sitting back down and picking up my fork. Mom's voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "How long have you known?" "About the Oscar nomination." "Since Tuesday," I said, taking a bite of pie. "Same day the federal indictments were announced." Michael leaned forward, his lawyer instincts finally kicking in. "Sarah, this is incredible. Do you realize what this means? A documentary that directly influences federal legislation, leads to major prosecutions and gets Oscar recognition? This is career-defining work. I nodded calmly. The distributor seemed to think so. Netflix acquired worldwide rights for $8.5 million. HBO is doing a limited series based on the investigation. Grandma Rose spoke for the first time since the phone call. Sarah, dear, why didn't you tell us? It was a fair question. I set down my fork and looked around the table at faces that had spent 3 years expressing concern, disappointment, and barely concealed embarrassment about my chosen path. When would I have told you? I asked quietly. During the conversations about how my film thing wasn't working? Or when you were explaining that I needed a real job? Maybe when you were introducing me to your friends as someone who was still figuring things out. The words hung heavy between us. I hadn't intended them to sound as cutting as they did, but 3 years of dismissed dreams had sharpened them to a point. Dad's face had gone pale. We were worried about you. You were struggling financially, working odd hours, never seeming to make progress. I was making progress, I said. I was building one of the most comprehensive investigations of municipal fraud in recent history. I was learning federal procurement law, developing relationships with whistleblowers, teaching myself forensic accounting. I was working 18-hour days because that's what the story required. Mom's eyes were beginning to water. But you never said anything. You never told us what you were really working on. Would you have listened? I asked gently. Or would you have told me to get a real job anyway? The question settled over the table like dust. We all knew the answer. My phone buzzed again, a text this time. I glanced at it and couldn't suppress a small smile. That's my publicist, I said. Apparently Good Morning America wants to do a segment tomorrow about documentary filmmakers who influence policy. Michael was staring at his hands. Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. I had no idea the scope of what you were working on. The film premieres in limited release next month, I continued, not unkindly. Then it goes wide in February, just before the Oscars. The story's already sparked congressional hearings about federal oversight of municipal contracts. 2 of the companies involved have filed for bankruptcy. Dad had pushed his plate away, his appetite apparently gone. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years we've been telling you to give up on your dream. 4 years actually, I corrected. I started preliminary research 4 years ago. The filming took 3 years. The correction landed like a physical blow. 4 years of family dinners where they'd questioned my choices, suggested alternatives, worried aloud about my future. 4 years of treating my work like an expensive hobby that would eventually need to be abandoned for something practical. Mom stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen. I could hear her opening and closing cabinet doors with more force than necessary. A sure sign she was processing strong emotions. Sarah, Grandma Rose said, her voice carrying a weight of years, your grandfather would have been proud. Building something important piece by piece, even when others couldn't see the vision. That takes courage. The acknowledgement hit differently coming from her. Grandma Rose had lived through the Depression, had seen real hardship, real failure. For her to recognize my work as worthwhile meant something profound. Dad cleared his throat again. The money you mentioned, the Netflix deal, that's real? $8.5 million for worldwide distribution rights, I confirmed. Plus performance bonuses if it wins awards or generates a certain number of views. HBO paid another $3.2 million for the limited series rights. The number seemed to physically stagger him. In 3 years of lectures about financial responsibility, he'd never asked about the potential upside of my work, only focused on the apparent lack of immediate returns. Mom returned from the kitchen, her eyes red but her voice steady. I called Mrs. Henderson, she announced. I needed to tell someone that my daughter is nominated for an Oscar. The admission broke something open in the room. This woman who had spent years apologizing for my life choices to her friends had just called one of them to brag. What did she say? I asked. She said she always knew you were working on something important, Mom replied, not quite meeting my eyes. She said she could tell from how you talked about your work that it mattered to you in a way most jobs don't matter to people. It was a generous interpretation, given that Mrs. Henderson had been one of the friends suggesting I consider teaching. My phone rang again, another New York number. This time I recognized it as my newly assigned publicist. Sarah? It's Rebecca from the agency. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but we've got a situation developing. 3 more news programs want interviews by tomorrow, and the Los Angeles Times wants to do a profile piece about documentary filmmakers who influence policy. Also, and this is big, the film just got accepted into Sundance as a special screening, and they want to do a panel discussion about journalism and documentary work. I looked around the table at my family, all of whom were listening intently to every word. That sounds manageable, I said. What about the 60 Minutes interview we just scheduled? That's confirmed for Thursday, but they want to expand it now. Apparently, this morning's federal indictments are being called the most significant municipal corruption prosecutions in 20 years. Your work is being credited as the catalyst. After I hung up, the silence felt different again. Not uncomfortable now, but contemplative. Michael spoke first. Sarah, I need to ask, and please understand this comes from a place of professional curiosity, not family criticism. How did you know to pursue this story? What made you think there was something worth investigating? It was the first time in years he'd asked about my work with genuine interest rather than barely concealed concern. Pattern recognition, I said. I was filming a small piece about urban development and noticed the same contractors winning bids despite not being the lowest bidders. Same law firms handling the contracts. Same city council members voting for projects that seemed to benefit the same small group of companies. Dad leaned forward, his accounting background finally engaged. And you documented all of this? Everything. Financial records, meeting minutes, recorded conversations with people willing to talk on the record, video evidence of meetings that were supposed to be private. It took 3 years because I had to be absolutely certain of every connection before making accusations. 3 years of work we kept telling you to abandon, Mom said quietly. The weight of that realization settled over all of us. 3 years of family gatherings where they'd suggested I give up, get a real job, stop chasing dreams. 3 years where I'd been building a case that would ultimately change federal oversight policies and put 17 people in prison. Grandma Rose reached across the table and patted my hand. Tell me about the Oscar nomination, she said. I want to understand what that means. For the next hour, I found myself explaining my work to my family for the first time. Really explaining it, not deflecting their concerns or changing the subject, but describing the investigation, the filming process, the months of editing, the legal reviews, the careful verification of every claim. They listened with an attention I hadn't experienced from them in years. Dad asked detailed questions about the financial evidence. Mom wanted to understand how I'd convinced people to talk on camera about illegal activities. Michael was fascinated by the legal implications and the federal prosecutor's use of documentary evidence in criminal cases. By the time we finished talking, it was nearly 10 o'clock. 3 hours past our usual Sunday dinner end time. Sarah, Dad said as I was preparing to leave, I need to say something. Your mother and I spent 3 years worrying about your financial stability, your career prospects, your future security. We thought we were being responsible parents by encouraging you to consider more traditional paths. He paused, looking older than I'd seen him look before. What we were actually doing was trying to get you to abandon the most important work of your life because we couldn't understand it. That's not responsible parenting. That's fear masquerading as wisdom. Mom nodded, tears she'd been holding back finally spilling over. We're proud of you. We're so proud of you, and we're sorry it took an Oscar nomination for us to say it. The apology meant everything and nothing at the same time. Everything because it acknowledged years of dismissed dreams and unrecognized sacrifice. Nothing because the work itself hadn't changed, only their perception of its value. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps family relationships, like documentary investigations, sometimes require external validation before the full picture becomes clear. As I drove home that night, my phone buzzed with text messages from cousins, family friends, and relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. Word was spreading about the nomination, about the federal indictments, about the Sunday dinner revelation. The messages followed a predictable pattern. Congratulations mixed with surprise, as if my success had materialized from nowhere rather than emerging from 4 years of methodical work they'd watched me do. But one message stood out from my cousin Jennifer, the one with the 401k and health insurance who'd been held up as the model of practical success. Sarah, I just heard about your Oscar nomination. I wanted you to know that I've always admired your commitment to your work, even when other people didn't understand it. What you've accomplished is incredible, and the impact you're having on public policy is exactly why journalism matters. Congratulations on proving that following your passion can change the world. I saved that message not because it changed anything about the work itself, but because it reminded me that validation, from family, from peers, from institutions, while meaningful, was never the point. The point had always been the story itself. The corruption exposed, the justice served, the systems improved. The Oscar nomination was wonderful, the family recognition was healing, but the real measure of success was in the federal indictments announced that morning and the reforms that would follow. As I pulled into my apartment complex, my phone rang one more time. Another New York number. Ms. Williams? This is the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. We wanted to personally congratulate you on your nomination and discuss the timeline for the ceremony. We also wanted you to know that your film is being used as a case study in journalism schools across the country. The impact you're having extends far beyond entertainment. I thanked them and hung up, then sat in my car for a moment, processing the day's revelations. 4 years ago, I'd started investigating what seemed like small-time corruption in municipal contracts. 3 years ago, my family had begun their campaign to convince me to get a real job. This morning, 17 people had been indicted based on evidence I'd collected and verified. This afternoon, my family had finally understood what I'd been building. The vindication felt complete, but it also felt beside the point. The real satisfaction wasn't in proving my family wrong about my choices. It was in knowing that the work itself had mattered, had made a difference, had created lasting change. And tomorrow I'd go back to my cluttered apartment, my secondhand equipment, and my irregular schedule, because there were other stories to tell, other injustices to expose, other systems that needed the kind of patient, methodical investigation that changes everything. The family recognition was nice, but the work had always been enough.